And uh, and sorry, I just had to flick off the recording. It was blocking my screen. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to give this talk, to think about what I did with much of my career, and I hope that it will be interesting to all of you. Um, Maybe I ought to explain at the outset why I'm speaking about the news business under the auspices of the Carpenter's Boat Shop in Pemaquid, Maine. I had recently left daily journalism to work on longer projects when an uncle and I were walking a hiking trail in Pemaquid. We spotted an old boat sitting on the hard at the entrance to an even older farmstead some distance from any substantial body of water. We walked over to see what it was, and a friendly gentleman, a few years younger than I, came up to ask if we needed help. We asked where we were, and he explained it was a woodworking enterprise that taught apprentices how to build wooden boats. The workshop is over there, he said, pointing to what apparently had once been a chicken house, and gave us a quick description of the layout. Then he apologized, saying he was late for a picnic and had to leave to join the others. There are no locks on the doors, he added. You're free to look around and come back with any questions. We did look around, and I returned not long afterward with one of my sisters and her son, and we took a week-long summer class in which we built a lovely little Monhegan skiff. That boat will go back in the water next month for its 18th season as our tender on the Damariscotta. And that guy who introduced us to the Carpenter's Boat Shop turned out to be Bobby Ives, who founded the shop more than 40 years ago and will be teaching that week-long skiff building class this summer for the umpteenth time. And this time, my son and I will be taking it together. For me, part of the magic of the boat shop is that its staff, apprentices, and its wider community of friends offer a special open and welcoming environment that restores my soul after exposure to a long winter of discouraging cynicism in the nation's capital. And it's that other world where I have spent most of the last 50 years that I came to talk about tonight. After I talk a while about my life in journalism and what has become of that world, I hope you will join the discussion by asking questions that undoubtedly will lead us into avenues I won't have covered. Alicia will explain that procedure if she hasn't already, but basically, if you have a question, enter it in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take it from there. The late Richard Pyle, who was my bureau chief at the Associated Press in Vietnam and remained a colleague and friend until his death almost 5 years ago, grew increasingly reflective toward the end of his 49 years with the AP. You know, he said one day, you and I had the good fortune to work during the golden age of journalism. He pegged that age, roughly, from the outbreak of World War II through Watergate, perhaps its high point, and the precipitous decline triggered by the revolution in information technology that radically changed the news world I loved. As it happened, I was remarkably fortunate to be in the right place at the right time to cover some really great stories. I got my first real reporting assignment from the editor of my college newspaper, the Daily Tar Heel, at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He sent me and another would-be journalist, Ford Rowan, to Oxford, Mississippi to cover the admission of James Meredith, a Black man, to the University of Mississippi, known to all as Ole Miss. We got there in time to witness and report on the campus riot that night, in which 2 men, one of them a reporter, were shot to death by rioters. Dozens of federal marshals and US Army troops were among the hundreds wounded. I was hooked. For me, it was the beginning of a year covering the civil rights movement in Chapel Hill and throughout the South, including Martin Luther King Jr.'s leading mass demonstrations of thousands of young people in Birmingham, Alabama. You've all seen those pictures. And the March on Washington, at which King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. I dropped out of college and found work at a daily newspaper in West Virginia, where I learned the fundamentals. Went back to Chapel Hill to finish my degree and started work for the Associated Press the next day, covering politics and state government in Raleigh, North Carolina. Less than 3 years later, after a stint on the foreign desk in New York, the AP sent me to Vietnam to cover the war, which by then was the biggest breaking news story in the world. It was all one might expect. Exciting, even exhilarating sometimes, controversial, frightening often, and dangerous now and then. It was also hugely important to millions of readers, the best reason I had for being there. After my second tour, based in what was then the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, I was transferred to Washington, where I fell into the Watergate story just before it exploded into the scandal that brought down President Nixon. I followed it for 18 months. I did, and that was a night and day job. Practically memorized the testimony at the Watergate hearings. I did investigative reporting for a while after that, then a year covering domestic affairs, and went to the White House to cover the Carter administration just before 52 American diplomats were taken hostage at the US Embassy in Tehran and held for the final 444 days of Jimmy Carter's presidency. They were freed within moments of Ronald Reagan taking the oath of office to succeed Carter. 3 months later, I was standing outside the Washington Hilton Hotel waiting for President Reagan to emerge from an uneventful speech to a labor group in the basement. I was hoping to catch Reagan's attention to ask him about a news story breaking abroad. And as he stepped out the door and started to wave, waving to a small crowd that had gathered, I shouted, "Mr. President!" And just as I thought he was beginning to turn toward me, 6 shots rang out from John Hinckley's pistol, one of which nearly killed Reagan. Other bullets took down Press Secretary Jim Brady, who never fully recovered, and seriously wounded a Secret Service agent and a local police officer. After 6 years covering the Reagan White House, I was asked by the AP to go to Moscow as chief of bureau to build up our coverage of Mikhail Gorbachev and the reforms he was making in the Soviet Union. Ann and I arrived with our kids, then 10 and 7, and brought along the first golden retriever in the Soviet Union. It was a tumultuous roller coaster ride for the next 3 years as the vast, little-seen country emerged from 70 years of communist rule and a Cold War. It was also a brutal lesson in how spoiled we had been in our own nation's capital, with a 2,500 square foot home in a nice, quiet neighborhood, unlimited choices of food to cook or eat out, cars that ran, and plenty of privileges and access granted to the press. Not to mention, in Washington, we never much thought about whether anyone was following us or listening to our private conversations. In Moscow, we had to assume we were always under surveillance. We came home exhausted, but forever grateful we and our children had the opportunity to watch a great revolution, even one that, in the end, didn't hold. Well, that's about enough about me, except to mention my last job, one that I actually asked for. I was at the Boston Globe in the 90s, and the revolution in personal technology was changing lives faster even than the fall of communism. I asked the newspaper to let me write about that and was given a column that ran weekly in the Globe and on New York Times News Service for 2 years. It wasn't about the business of high tech. It was about personal computers, phones, beepers in those days too, and the race to give consumers new and different tools to help them work and play better and faster. Some of those tools even worked, although I frequently complain even today that I spend more time struggling with the still buggy technology than using it. One day, early in Bill Clinton's presidency, I was talking to one of the many young people who had joined the new president's staff, only to find the technology in the White House was generations behind the little Macintosh computers and campus networks they had used in school and college. You ought to get yourself on the internet, this guy said. There are 26 million people out there using it. That seemed like a lot, and it was probably an exaggeration. But at that time, almost all of them were military, NASA, or government scientists and university academics, many of whom probably didn't know they had access to it or how to use it. Soon after, I did get a private, non-government account that gave me entry to the internet. It was still text only then, but a piece of it used hypertext protocol that we now think of as links to click on and jump instantly almost anywhere. The graphical environment that became the World Wide Web was still in development, but not far off. I remember trying to explain to my father, a lifelong technology skeptic, then in his late 80s, that the internet was going to be the greatest advance in public communication since the printing press that produced the Gutenberg Bible in the 1400s. It wasn't long before I realized that newspapers, including my employer, were going to be in serious trouble. Stung by the bug of infinite possibilities, I joined others preaching the potential of the web to editors and publishers. But the response was almost always the same. You tell me how to make money on the internet, and I'll put up a website. They weren't ready to listen. And other, more technically adept players got in and ate their lunch. There are few, if any, newspapers making money on the web today, but they no longer have the option of waiting for the payback. Even with lower rates for online ads, there's little question that print is fading fast, and all news will be delivered electronically. Most of it already is. According to the latest Pew Research Center's study of the way people get their news, 86% of American adults, more than 8 out of 10, said they get news on their iPhones, tablets, or computers. And 60%, 6 out of 10, do so often. A mere 10%, 10% said they often read the news in print. You can be sure the spread is even greater today because that study was done 2 years ago. Things change fast. Many cities had at least 2 daily newspapers in the 1950s, one publishing in the morning and the other in the afternoon. A few, like New York and Chicago, had several. But the competition for readers and advertisers began to gobble them up. And when television reached the mass market, the decline accelerated. The internet, and soon after, social media, drove many newspapers over the cliff. Today, there are only about 1,200 dailies in the United States, and many of those no longer publish on paper, or if they do, they hit the streets only 4 or 5 times a week. By one count, the number of newspapers has fallen 40% in the last 20 years. Once great voices, such as the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Baltimore Sun, are mere shadows of their former selves. Some, like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, are still great sources, not only of breaking news, but as platforms for varying opinions and remarkable investigative reporting. Their online editions now far outstrip their paper editions, but no one has figured out how the changing revenue models will support successful for-profit news media. The smartest ones are using their reputations and their products to extend their franchises in all directions, holding conferences, running news-related cruises, partnering with independent foundations to help support the high cost of reporting and editing. The saddest stories are of those newspapers that have been acquired by hedge funds or other private equity firms with no particular interest in news, but in slashing production costs, milking every penny from the diminished publications, and selling off the valuable real estate. Chicago Tribune, once the proud owner and occupant of the 36-floor century-old Tribune Tower in the heart of the city, is now produced by a skeleton staff in a building several blocks away. Alden Global Capital, a secretive New York hedge fund, now counts the Trib among its holdings that make it the second largest newspaper publisher in the country. The Washington Post was more fortunate. It sold itself to Amazon billionaire Jeff Bezos, who appears content to make his profits elsewhere while investing generously in the Post. Network television broadcasts, which dominated the national news audience for years, have lost ground too. As viewership aged and the young have gone online, ABC, NBC, and CBS have closed many of their bureaus abroad and pared their staffs to a relative handful of regular correspondents. Night after night, the evening news is dominated by fixtures like storms, forest fires, and dramatic accidents that make for dramatic video and require limited production costs. You've probably noticed, if you watch them, that those programs are also financed largely by pharmaceutical companies who know exactly what that audience is, the older people with any number of different health problems. TV crews used to finance the largest chunk of money for a chartered press plane to follow Air Force One wherever the president went. As the costs rose and revenues declined, the nets bailed on presidential travel, and other media couldn't support the increased costs. Sometime during the Obama administration, the press charter just quit flying. It's not because of the new owner, but Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post tells me the job of a reporter there is no longer what it was. I spent most of my career with the AP, a nonprofit cooperative that answered to a few thousand editors and publishers who demanded accurate reporting delivered as close to immediately as possible because somebody somewhere was on deadline every minute. We were good at producing, but the pressure has increased tremendously. There's no such thing as deadline anymore, Tumulty told me. The web is driving everything. It's just ridiculous. That's where the reporting suffers. Hardly anyone gets the time, once used, to produce a well-groomed story for the next day's paper or even a future edition. One of the guides of a wire service like the AP was, get it first, but first get it right. It was not easy, but Tumulty said, it's just ridiculous today. That's where the reporting suffers. What's missing? That last phone call you wish you had made. One other perspective you wish you had gotten. It's all about speed. Jim Sciutto, who just returned from his second assignment covering the Russian invasion of Ukraine for CNN, said the time change and current technology made coverage of the war a 24-hour-a-day job. Communications via cell phones and high-speed networks meant CNN could cover the war in real time. The video wasn't necessarily live, but the anchors were, and the news flowed quickly from stricken cities into bureaus hastily set up in Kyiv or Lviv, edited, checked, and featured by correspondents reporting live from Ukraine. It was more dramatic, timely, and horrifying than almost anything broadcast during the television war. As many called the conflict in Vietnam, traumatic as it was, there was no way to transmit video shot on film, shipped to Saigon, flown to Hong Kong or Tokyo, and sent by satellite, processed there and sent by satellite to New York to be edited and put together for broadcast in less than about 3 days. Sciutto said many of the changes and much of the pressure have come since he covered the Iraq War for ABC News. That required gathering string, conducting interviews, tying all the material together, and putting it on for the evening news, frequently on a later day. And it would only air once. CNN puts its stuff on as fast as it can and reuses its war pieces over and over in the course of 24 hours, sometimes longer. But CNN has its financial challenges as well. Its revenues come mostly from cable companies that subscribe to CNN as one of many channels they offer viewers. As more and more people are cutting the cord and relying on less expensive sources like broadband, which we hope, by the way, to get in South Bristol, Maine one of these days. But they hope for their sources. They're getting it in much of the country now and much of the world. And CNN is searching for a new model to keep it in the game. Driving the news that gets the most attention, like it or not, is one source: Twitter. Even before Donald Trump made it his preferred platform for communicating with his followers, news tips, official pronouncements, and major developments often hit Twitter first, and reporters had no choice but to track it. In one sense, it appeared to democratize the information space. Anybody could play for free by posting tweets or retweeting the posts of others, thus expanding their reach. But the freewheeling, uncontrolled digital space quickly exposed a critical weakness. Misinformation, even bald-faced lies, spread quickly, and corrections lag far behind or are ignored entirely. Willfully false tweets, let's call them lies, circulate with abandon and can damage reputations, products, political campaigns, whatever, and there is rarely a price to pay by the instigator. The Twitterverse quickly attracted trolls and other malign players, and electronic bots, as in robots, soon infected the space, challenging legitimate participants, stealing data, and distorting the impact of tweets. My longtime colleague, Terrence Hunt, who led the AP's White House coverage for years and later managed much of the Washington Bureau's news report, said Twitter presented a particular challenge to the AP, which is a nonprofit cooperative owned by its member newspapers and broadcasters. One of its greatest strengths has always been its speed, but racing to put news on Twitter meant others would be getting at least a taste of the story before it was fed directly to paying members and subscribers, who were just as time-conscious as others. AP chose to serve its bosses and its customers, many of whom were already struggling financially in the new environment themselves. The result often left false rumors or erroneous reports standing in the Twitterverse until the wire service's fact-checked account reached Twitter's followers. And of course, there are other media players racing to be first too. Nonetheless, Twitter is a huge source of breaking news, Tumulty of the Post told me. The platform is a favorite of the official community in Washington, the news media that cover it, and political players everywhere. Reporters can't ignore it, and it sucks them in, if only to protect themselves against surprises. It eats up lots of Tumulty's time, even though she has stepped away from spot news reporting to write columns and edit the paper's editorial page. A glance at her screen showed she was following 3,700 people on Twitter and has 189,000 followers herself. The importance of accuracy hasn't changed for most media, even if the rush to publish leads to more mistakes or incomplete stories. What changed dramatically with the election of Donald Trump was the media's struggle to hold him and his administration to account when they simply ignored the facts, even the fundamentals of science. Terry Hunt recalled that his staff's job changed almost instantly when the new president claimed 1 million or 1.5 million people attended his inauguration. Sean Spicer, his press secretary, insisted it was the largest audience ever to witness an inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe. It was, of course, no such thing. The next day, Trump's counselor, Kellyanne Conway, defended the spokesman, saying there were alternative facts supporting him. Hunt said the AP and many other outlets immediately set up fact checkers if they didn't have them already, and it became a full-time job for a lot of people, just to test the administration's assertions, and other publications and others who needed fact-checking. But calling a lie didn't bother Trump, nor has it caused him to stop claiming his reelection was stolen from him by massive fraud in multiple states, despite the lack of evidence. There is some dispute about whether Daniel Patrick Moynihan or James R. Schlesinger said it first, but I happily accept their premise that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And finally, I must mention another outgrowth of technology that bedevils honest reporting. I'm not a techie, but I know a little bit about decision making by algorithm. Do you know what an algorithm looks like? It's computer code, unreadable to the untrained reader, including me. The best known and probably most studied example is the Google search algorithm that constantly and repeatedly analyzes the content of billions of web pages. And when you enter a search term in the Google search box, it almost as instantly decides what is most relevant to your search based on its secret code and serves up its best guesses of pages relevant to your query. But that's just the beginning of what algorithms do. They can buy and sell stock, decide if you are a credit risk, map your trip across the country, or find your car in a parking lot. The one that worries me the most was developed for YouTube, another Google company you may have searched yourself. One of the functions of the YouTube algorithm offer searchers videos that would keep viewers online. Keeping eyeballs on the screen is critical to selling advertising, which is the primary source of revenue for many of the web's most popular social media websites. New York Times reporter Kevin Roose dug into the experience of a young college dropout who was drawn to extreme right-wing conspiracy theories by people and places he visited on YouTube. What Roose discovered was that YouTube's algorithm, ostensibly designed to keep viewers engaged and online by offering them connections to keep their interest, served a very different purpose. It connected vulnerable minds who had lost sight of reality and began to think the world was made up of dangerous leaders conspiring to take over the world. QAnon was born. Roose called it the rabbit hole effect, and his convincing investigations that followed confirmed that the effect was not only widespread, but extremely difficult for outsiders to penetrate and bring affected viewers back to the real world. Well, with that, I think I've said enough. I hope you found some of this interesting, and I would love to take some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. I've got some great questions here for you, and I encourage you all to also add to our chat box. So I'm going to get us started. You ready, Michael?
I'm ready.
All right, wonderful job. I'll start with this question. You properly reference the lies/false statements, such as about stolen elections, and that those lies seem to be seen as true, or at least worthy of reporting. Witness the allegedly stolen election of 2020, which still is a huge news story with Trump playing the band. The news media has heavily covered these lies. Has the media inadvertently undercut its effectiveness by covering these false stories instead of real news?
You know, deciding what is the real news is always a challenge. And there are lots of ways to try to define it. I used to struggle with the idea myself a lot, to decide whether a story was, well, what the lead of the story was, for instance, from a presidential news conference or whatever. And I kind of leaned hard on the idea that news was made when something changed. And that particular line that the election was stolen hasn't changed. But the newsmaker involved, the principal newsmaker involved, is still there, is still saying it, and he's persuaded lots and lots of people. And they are still saying it. And every time one of them gets on Twitter and enlivens the debate for another several thousand or million people or whatever it is, reporters can't ignore it. They have to. They don't have any choice. They have to report what is going on in the places where news is made. And I think that's one of the reasons why I said Twitter is driving it.
Michael, what historically caused the change in approach for news media to go from facts to opinions?
Well, first of all, I don't grant that. Um, the news media are made up of many, many different voices, many, many different writers, some of whom are what I call straight news people, and some of whom are deliberate opinion makers. And there are those who make their own judgments in what should be news stories. Um, there isn't one conspiratorial group out there called the press or the media that makes up the stories every day and decides what people ought to believe. I'm very grateful for that, and I'm glad that it still exists. But there are editors who feel that you can go farther, you can go further with an analysis than you can in a straight news story. And there are others that don't pretend otherwise. Nobody could persuade me that Fox News is trying to be a news organization. It has a very specific goal. It doesn't hide that, although it sometimes does. It does report news, but that's not its overall objective, and you shouldn't be persuaded that it's just like all the others. It's not.
Nice talk, Michael. My question, as someone who is about your same age, this is not me. Could there be another Walter Cronkite?
Oh, no. I think one of the things that has changed everything in this new world of multiple sources is that there's so many places to go that it's a very disparate audience now. You know, when Cronkite was the anchor of the CBS Evening News, he basically only had two competitors, ABC and NBC, and he was a giant. He also worked very, very hard at being what I consider a great newsman, trying to be fair, trying to represent views fairly. And it took him a long time to conclude for himself and say publicly that he believed not that America was wrong at Vietnam, not that they shouldn't have gone there or anything. He just said they weren't winning. And guess what? He was damn right. And that was 1968. And the war continued on and on and on after that. But he was almost unique in his position. And I don't think that can ever be true again because there are so many voices vying for your eyes and ears.
Michael, what suggestions do you have for us as individuals and more broadly as a society to regain our common language and understanding of the world around us so that we can begin to reunite as a nation and a world?
Wow. You know, I'm just as troubled by that question as everyone else. I think the faces I see on this screen have grown up in a world where we took democracy for granted, hoped everybody would come along, and we trusted, you know, the values that we grew up with. They weren't all the same values, of course, but we had faith in them, and we tried to follow them. The world has changed, and you know, what do you do when an autocrat like Putin decides that he's going to invade his neighbor and kill as many innocent people as he can? You know, it does stretch one's faith, I think. Is democracy going to survive this? not just in Ukraine, but in the United States. The challenge is here, going on right now in our political system, through legislatures, through gerrymandering by legislatures, through various kinds of conspiracies, and a lot of pretty open political combat. But there are a very substantial number of people in this country who don't really want a government decided by a democratic vote. They want their representatives to have the voice. And I don't know how that's going to come out.
Thank you. Michael, how do you consume your news on an average day?
Well, I get up in the morning and start with the New York Times and sometimes the Washington Post. Ann gets the Washington Post first. I get the New York Times first, and I read as much as I can before it's time to go to work. And all day long, I am drawn to things, breaking news, whatever, just because I'm a news hound. I don't do nearly as much as I used to, and of course the stakes aren't the same because it doesn't matter if I miss something. But I'm still very much engaged in reading through the day. I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter. It's a terrible time sink for me, and I think it is for many. And the same is true of Facebook, although I am on Facebook and do use it for promoting my books and stuff like that. But I try not to get too sucked in because it's all so easy to, look up a half hour later and find out that you're learning about the children of somebody your daughter went to Anglo-American school with in Moscow 30 years ago. And, it's not that it's totally irrelevant, but it's not all that important.
Michael, will you tell us what you think the relationship is between your career writing news stories and your interest now in building another skiff that ties in with your son?
Oh, wow.
Softball.
I'm going to fall back on my mentor, Bobby Ives, on this one. Very early in my getting to know Bobby, he told me that he taught one of his classes to preachers, and Bobby, as you know, many of you know, is a preacher himself. But he said that he found that particularly pastors who'd been doing their job for a long time, giving their sermons pretty much the same or rewriting them every week, whatever, kind of lost touch with what they were doing and what was important. And he said he started a class for them because building a skiff, they could actually make something with their hands and see what they had done that day and take credit for it or figure out how to fix the problems they'd created and the mistakes they'd made. And it was a much more tangible reward for them than giving a sermon they were already familiar with, or maybe even writing a new one. And a lot of them got strength from that. And I think I fell in love with woodworking for that reason too, that I'm not very good at it, I don't pretend to be, but it's a great way to spend real time paying attention to something that is real and in front of you and in your own hands.
Michael, American journalism has been plagued by biased news throughout history and subsequently imposed. Any thoughts on how we will return to an era of factual news in mainstream and social media?
Well, first of all, I would say that the history of news in the United States is not a history of unbiased, what some people call objective reporting. When Richard Powell was talking about the golden age of journalism, he was talking about not long after the discovery that writers should try to report whatever they found, not just what they wanted to find. And that tradition wasn't new by then. I mean, the AP had been doing this since well before the Civil War. But most newspapers and most other outlets that came after didn't start with the idea of fair and impartial news reports. It got to be that way, and it was a great time. I'll be damned if I know how we get back to it. But one of the things that troubles me most is that in looking at the struggles we're having right now over things like school curricula, and the fights going on in public school board meetings and things, I really worry that the generation that's growing up now, being educated in schools, is not going to have the same kind of respect and appreciation for what we think of as the truth. How do you determine the truth? What is it? How do you find out? If we stay in the silos that are being built all around us, we're not going to find the answers to that. And I think that's very troubling.
Michael, what do you think are the most important steps that needs to be taken to restore trust in reliable media sources? I have to say, I don't believe in censorship. And at the same time, I'm torn, like many people, with who you let have the reins, for instance, to Twitter. And how do you bar people? And on what grounds? The First Amendment has been one of the most meaningful parts of my life as long as I can remember. And I well remember Thomas Jefferson, who said, and I can't quote this exactly, but it's close, if there be any among us who would destroy our system of government or change its Republican ways, let him stand as a monument to the freedom with which error of opinion can be tolerated when reason is left free to combat it. Well, I loved that line, and I've lived by that line, but I'm not sure it'll hold up, because there's a lot of reason out there and a lot of people who don't want to listen to reason. And, they're not all commies in the Soviet Union or whatever. Some of them are in our own backyards, and they have their way. They want to win. They want to come out on top, and they believe they're right. I mean, I think that's one of the dreadful problems we have with racism now, because some of the most passionate people in the world, are white guys who are out to establish their supremacy over what they see as invaders. And they don't see anything else.
So if you've got a solution, somebody else get on the chat. Let's have some answers.
So it's 10 minutes of, I'm gonna unmute you all so that if anybody has any last questions, you can ask Michael directly. And also just we can have a big goodbye to each other, but I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you all and yeah, ask Michael any questions that you might have, or you can unmute yourself too.
Okay, this is Phil Caper, an old friend of Mike's.
And a great sailor.
crew member- And a great sailor. Mike was part of my crew on the 1992 Marion to Bermuda race, which was great. Mike, I wrote a question in the chat.
Capital B.
Your description of what's happening with the hedge funds taking over journalism really resonated with me. Yes. Really resonated with me because the same thing is happening in medicine, and it's happening quickly. And how would you like your doctor to be owned by a hedge fund? And that's what's going on now in healthcare.
I should point out that Dr. Phil Caper
In the plaid shirt. It is. It's
did
pretty
practice
obvious.
medicine and was deeply involved in policy as a
It's just a background.
the health expert for Senator Edward Kennedy, and made it a lot of his life's work to try to bring the medical care system in the United States together to share information and help doctors everywhere understand their patients better. And I've admired Phil for that as much as I did that he's also a remarkable skipper and navigator. It's terrifying the amount of money that already controls our healthcare system. I mean, look at pharmaceuticals. There isn't any defense for this. So, why does something that costs 11 cents in Canada cost $25 in the United States? I mean, the price of lobbying in Washington and other places apparently is well spent to get the results they want. And Phil, you know that world better than I do, but I sure wish I knew how you kept the amateurs out of it, and especially the ones who only count the money.
Yeah, it is troubling. I recommend a great new book to you by Patrick Radden Keefe called Empire of Pain. And it's about the Sackler family and what they have done to the commercialization, particularly the pharmaceutical industry, but also, of course, the opioid epidemic. It's all about the money. It's a national disease, I think.
Well, an awful lot has become all about the money, and that seems to be a leading value right now. And I don't really know what you do about that.
Call it out.
Try it, yes.
So Mike, let me take you back to journalism. A 21-year-old comes to you and they want to have a career in journalism. Do you encourage them to become a journalist, and how do you direct them to have a rewarding career?
Oh, George, I had an easy answer for that for a long, long time. The answer was simply to find a small daily newspaper in some small city with a good city editor and go to work there and learn the basics, as I did at the Charleston Gazette in West Virginia. And I had several colleagues who were brilliant. Some of them stayed and many of them left, but we all gained a lot from that. And when kids came to me when I was at the AP and at the Globe, and I fielded this question often, I often gave the same advice. But now, where do you send them? I mean, it's not, there is the Lincoln County News, and it is occasionally a very interesting newspaper, but it doesn't, it's not going to accommodate a whole lot of people. And the young people getting out today have very little association with newspapers that are still mostly in print. And so I think if you can find a respectable, honest online publication, that's a great thing. And we're starting to see those. Some of them are nonprofits. Some of them are foundation supported in order to enable them to do honest reporting. There's one I know that I've kept tabs on occasionally in Hawaii. There are other more ambitious projects in New York and elsewhere. The Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting is a fascinating place that funds some very interesting work. So, I don't give up, but I don't feel that I have the experience to give kids that same advice today. But there are hopeful places to land.
Would you send them to PBS or NPR?
Absolutely. I think NPR is doing a remarkable job of covering the country and the world with the resources it has, and trying very hard to stick to the knitting of what we think of as news judgment.
And Axios has local bureaus.
And I should mention, with a little bit of coaching from my best partner, that Axios is starting a new hyper-local news system that will provide a lot of jobs, I think, to young people learning the way. And Axios, if you don't follow it, Axios does a lot of good reporting itself. Anyone? Have I worn you all out?
Mike, when will we see you at the boat shop?
In less than a month. And have you got your class together yet, George?
I'm talking to Alicia next week sometime.
Aha. Well, anybody who wants to learn from a master craftsman, keep your eye out for George Ingram's class at the boat shop. I think it's going to be a 1 day or maybe 2, and there might be repeats after they find out how good he is as a teacher as well as a craftsman.
Mike charges for those advertisements.
Well, I have benefited from them. Let me put it that way.
So, Michael, it's fascinating to me that Heather Cox Richardson seems to be an example of an independent scholar whose work has captivated the extraordinary range of viewers and people who attend or wake up every morning to read her. I've always thought that commentator, I can't remember his name is Robert Haight, who had that wonderful piece in the Atlantic Monthly. His key recommendation was to make sure you expose yourself to viewpoints with which you disagree. that the importance of breaking out of the silo in which we almost invariably gravitate is absolutely pivotal to, again, building a reflex that allows for the discernment of truth. I'm wondering whether you see people like Heather Cox Richardson as changing or having any more enduring significance in the way in which news is disseminated.
Well, first of all, I think that Heather Cox Richardson is a phenom. And I think anyone should be thrilled that someone could start what she calls a letter from an American and become so incredibly popular in a relatively short time. She is read by many of us, and
She's got a million followers.
yeah, I think Substack, which is this unusual new platform, which is basically offering itself to anybody who can write and drum up an audience to read it. She is the queen of Substack. She's got, I think, 1 million or more followers, and a lot of the people who are signed up and subscribe to her actually pay for it. They don't have to. The New Yorker said a few months ago that Substack may be the new platform for information. Just, anything out there. Some things will catch on. She has. There are others who are popular, and there's some amazing things on there if you have time to look around. There's one guy who was a sports writer, I think, all his career, and is now writing stories about war correspondents, one at a time, and all different wars, different places, different situations. But some of those stories are fascinating, and a lot of them I've never heard before. So, I think there are opportunities like that, but how she struck a nerve, I'm not sure. My wife, Ann Blackman, heard about her from two friends, American friends, who live in France. Not together. These are two totally different sources. It just happened that these were Americans who were reading her in France and asked Ann if she'd ever heard of Heather Cox Richardson. And the answer quickly became, I do now. And, it's nice to have her as a neighbor on the other side of the peninsula. And Chris, I would add that I think you're also right about reaching out to different views than your own, and trying to stay aware of opposing views, whether they're right or wrong. Know what you're up to. Know what you're facing, and I think it's healthy. It's certainly not healthy to shut off every opposing view. The prejudices are a terrible thing to follow. And I know that in your life, you've made a determined effort to overcome that in the world of religion, where there may be less tolerance than anywhere.
Any more questions for Michael?
Michael, this is Steve Bright. Good to see you again.
Hello, Steve. It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Back to the boat shop.
I need to get out there. Yes, because we never finished that boat we started. I'm still very embarrassed about that one. Do we worry, or is there a concern education-wise or somewhere to get the youth to question the news source they get and verify it? And is this an educational issue? Is this a news issue? Or how do we approach that educational problem?
I think it is an educational issue, but not just in the schools. It's also the way parents educate their children and to whom those children are exposed. I think it's critical. What we look for in a school, those of us who have had the experience of a good education, we look for schools where teachers draw students out and challenge their thinking and teach them how to think about problems and issues. And that's still going on, but unfortunately, I worry that it's under dreadful pressure from people who have little respect for it, don't understand it. Alicia, I think we've worn them out.
I have one question. Do you have any ideas of possible ways to combat disinformation or discredit false information to people who are not willing to listen? For instance, people who listen and read Fox News and stick with that view.
You know, it's really tough. Not everyone wants to listen. I think we all know people who in the early days of the Trump administration, people who didn't agree were just left screaming, shouting at their adversaries. And I think they convinced almost no one. So, it's not an easy thing, but I think the awareness of a need for more points of view and for the use of reason and ethics and trying to draw people out and understand them better is our only hope. It's nice to have another graduate of that class in the Skiff building.
Thank you. Can't wait to come back one day.
Michael, thank you so much. It's a wonderful evening with you.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia, and to all of the Boat Shop community. And it's been wonderful to see some familiar faces I haven't seen in a long time, and to have a chance to think about and talk about things I care very deeply about and have most of my life. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Great
Good night.
job.
Thanks so much, Michael.